Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I will be discussing a commander I've been playing for a long time, Phenax, God of Deception. I'm hyped for the upcoming Theros set, so hopefully this brew can also quench your own excitement for the new set. If you're a patron of the Commander Tavern, then chances are that you saw this brew earlier. Phenax is a 4/7 legendary enchantment creature with indestructible for 3 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black. As long as your devotion to blue and black is less than 7, Phenax isn't a creature. He has a really unique ability in that he makes all of your creatures able to tap in order to mill an opponent for as many cards as their toughness. Since this is a tap ability attached to the creature, you can't activate it if the creature has summoning sickness. It's kind of obvious given his ability that Phenax is the go-to commander for milling. Milling isn't that viable a strategy in a 100-card deck format, but it's still very possible to win. However, the point of the deck isn't necessarily to just mill out opponents. That would be too inefficient. But we can also try to take advantage of what opponents are collecting in their graveyards. First things first though, let's see how we're going to use his main ability, milling. Phenax is pretty much the Therosian Sir Mix-a-Lot. He wants to lead a deck full of creatures that pack much back. The higher the toughness, the better. Fortunately, there are plenty of cheap creatures with a high toughness that can be included in this deck. Glacial Wall is a 0/7 wall with Defender for 2 generic and 1 blue. For just 3 mana, you can tap it to mill an opponent for 7. Being 0/7 isn't that bad either. It can survive blocking plenty of big creatures this format is prone to having. For some unknown reason, it's not a snow creature, but I digress. Similar to Glacial Wall is Wall of Frost, a 0/7 wall with Defender that costs 1 generic and 2 blue. It also freezes any creature it blocks. I also don't know why this creature wasn't made snow. Another similar creature is Hover Barrier, a 0/6 illusion wall with Defender and Flying for 2 generic and 1 blue. At the expense of 1 more point of toughness, it gets Flying. Wall of Junk is also a 0/7 wall, but it costs only 2 generic mana to cast. However, when it blocks, it must be returned to its owner's hand at the end of combat. That might seem like a big drawback, but it's not so overcosted. And when Paradox Engine wasn't banned, being able to consistently have something to cast is a blessing. One of the best walls in the deck is Shield Sphere. It's a 0/6 wall with Defender that costs a mere 0 generic mana to cast. What's the drawback? Whenever it blocks, you have to put a -0/-1 counter on it. That's not a big deal since it doesn't have to be assigned as a blocker unless you're in a pinch. Shield Sphere might be the best wall in the deck, but it's not the best defender. That honor goes to Tree of Perdition. Tree of Perdition is a 0/13 plant with Defender for just 3 generic and 1 black. That alone are amazing stats for this deck. However, that's not all. You can tap Tree of Perdition in order to exchange its toughness with target opponent's life total. In a format where the starting life is 40, you can easily make this creature's toughness become 40. There's even the possibility of it becoming even larger than that. Not only that, but you're making that opponent's life become 13, making it even easier for someone else to take that player out of the game via burn or combat damage. Having a toughness of 40 means that you can easily mill out an opponent in just 2 turns. It can also be used against opponents who have infinite life. You just make them have 13 life instead, which can be done. Tree of Perdition isn't the only creature that can get huge in the deck either. The deck runs Morphling, Aetherling, and Endling. Although they each have a bunch of useful abilities, it's their final ability that's most relevant for this deck. For just 1 generic mana, you can give them -1/+1 until end of turn. This is an amazing mana sink for this deck. At the end of the turn before yours, you can sink all your mana into any of them to give them a huge toughness boost in order to mill an opponent for even more cards than usual. That's why, of the 3, Morphling is the best one since it has a built-in untap ability. For 1 blue, you can untap Morphling. That means that it's much more effective to sink your blue mana into untapping Morphling than simply pumping its toughness. For example, 3 blue mana could be used to thrice untap Morphling, thus milling an opponent 12 cards for just 3 blue mana. If you have black mana, use that to pump Morphling and the blue to untap it. However, there is a threshold to this ability, and thus there's a point where it's better to use mana to pump instead of untap. For example, the best way to use 3 blue mana would be untapping Morphling 3 times in order to mill 12 cards. However, with 4 blue mana, it's better to pump Morphling's toughness once and then untap it thrice. This will mill 16 cards from an opponent's library. If you have used all 4 mana to untap Morphling, it only have milled 15 cards from opponent's library instead. Apart from these shapeshifters that can be pumped at will, the deck runs creatures that grow along with opponents' graveyards, those being Night Howler, Consuming Aberration, and White of Precinct 6. Night Howler is a 0/0 enchantment creature horror for 1 generic and 2 black, or you can cast it as an aura for 2 generic and 2 black since it has Bestow. It or the creature it enchants gets +X, where X is the number of creature cards in all graveyards. After milling enough opponents, or maybe after a couple of board wipes, this can enter the battlefield pretty huge. It could be used to continue milling opponents in order to continue getting bigger, or it could be used as a beater as well. Similarly, White of Precinct 6 is a 1/1 zombie for just 1 generic and 1 black, but it gets +1/+1 for each creature card in all opponents' graveyards. So, just like Night Howler, you can cast these creatures for cheap, but they're going to be huge as time goes by. Although costing a bit more at 3 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black, Consuming Aberration has a star power and toughness. Those stars are equal to the number of cards in opponents' graveyards, not just creature cards, but total cards. That means that this creature can exponentially mill an opponent. If it were to have a toughness of just 5, for example, you can use it to mill 5 cards, making it 10/10. Then it can mill 10 more, making it 20/20. Not only that, but it could be a huge beater as well. However, all of those pale in comparison to the best card in the entire deck, Eater of the Dead. An oldie but a goodie, this creature is perhaps best when paired with Phenax. The way this creature works is that you can untap it in order to exile a creature card from a graveyard. That means that you can tap it down again to mill an opponent for 4. Then, if a graveyard has a creature, you can do it all over again. You can see this interaction in one of the episodes of this stage. You can follow a link to that episode above. The reason this card is the best one in the deck is because it has the potential to mill the entire table in a single shot if you have Phenax in play. That's actually how I won that match in the aforementioned video. Tapping down creatures isn't the only way to mill out opponents either. You can attack an opponent with Fleet Swallower. Notice that the ability triggers when you attack with it, not if you successfully deal combat damage. So that means that by simply declaring it as an attacker, it mills half an opponent's library. You can also accomplish the same effect with casting Traumatize, which the deck also includes. Another amazing spell for milling opponents is Mind Grind. For just X, 1 blue, and 1 black, we can mill all opponents for an epic amount of cards. That's because X doesn't represent cards to mill, but land cards. That means that if X is something like 7, each opponent has to mill cards from the top of their library until they mill 7 lands. Worst case scenario is that an opponent mills 7 straight lands. However, chances are they mill much more, especially considering that players ramp a lot in this format, so their decks tend to get thinned of lands. We can also use Jace Memory Adept's second ability to mill an opponent for 10 cards without any change in his loyalty counters. This might seem inefficient compared to what else we can do, but with so many beefy defenders, it'll be hard to get rid of Jace. Also, if we need to draw a card, we can use his +1 ability instead, which can also mill an opponent for 1 too. On the topic of tapping down creatures with Phenax's ability, this is useful with tapping down creatures without having to attack with them. For example, King Makar the Gold Cursed has an amazing ability that triggers when he untaps. Whenever he becomes untapped, you can exile a creature and then create a gold token when you do. If you tap him down to mill, he'll untap during your untap step. You can then use his ability there. You can also do the same thing with Daring Thief. Untapping Daring Thief means that you can exchange a non-land permanent you control with one of the same type an opponent controls. That means you can trade away trash for treasure. But there are other ways to abuse tapping and untapping in this deck. In order to reuse these abilities, the deck includes ways to untap creatures. Jace Ingenious Mind Mage might appear to be a subpar version of him because of his appearance in a Planeswalker deck, but he's crazy in this deck. With his second +1 ability, we can untap all of our creatures. That means that we can tap them down in our turn, then untap them to have them ready to tap down again at the end of the turn before ours. Or we can use our fatties to attack and then untap them to tap them later on to mill opponents at the end of the turn before ours. The deck runs 1000-Year Elixir, which allows our creatures to tap down as if they had haste, but it doesn't really give them haste. That just means that we can use them to tap even though they have Summoning Sickness. We just can't attack with them the turn they enter the battlefield. Also, we can pay 1 generic and tap the elixir down to untap one of our creatures. This pairs great with the creature-like tree of Perdition. We can tap it down to exchange its toughness with an opponent's life, untap it with the elixir, and then tap it down to mill a massive amount of cards in the same turn. However, the best untappers in the deck are Penman's Aura and Freed from the Reel. Penman's Aura and Freed from the Reel are auras that allow you to tap or untap the creature it's enchanting for just 1 blue mana. This is crazy in this deck. With enough mana, you can mill an opponent out in the same turn. Of the two, Penman's Aura is superior since it makes the creature it enchants similar to Morphling. You can pay 1 generic to give the enchanted creature -1/+1. You can also pay 1 blue to give it Flying or Shroud. Shroud being a great keyword to protect the creature. Another key interaction with Penman's Aura is attaching it to King Makar, because you can tap King Makar down and then pay 1 blue to untap it with Penman's Aura. Doing so makes him exile a creature an opponent controls. This gives you a gold token. You can then tap him down again to mill, and then sacrifice the gold token to get that blue mana to untap him with Penman's Aura. That means that you can do this all over again until you can essentially exile all creatures from the battlefield that your opponents control. Besides a slow route to victory, you can also take advantage of the milling itself. For example, the deck runs Diluvian Primordial and Sepulchre Primordial. Although each costs 7 mana, they have a relevant body for their casting cost. What makes it worth our while is their Enter the Battlefield ability. When Diluvian Primordial enters the battlefield, for each opponent we get to cast up to 1 instant or sorcery card from their graveyard without paying its mana cost. If we do, that spell gets exiled afterwards. With Sepulchre Primordial, we get to reanimate up to 1 creature from each opponent's graveyard. This is crazy. In EDH, players tend to include Haymaker cards and huge creatures in their decks. If we milled anything amazing, we get to use them for free when having these creatures enter the battlefield. Imagine being able to not just cast Expropriate for free from an opponent's graveyard, but 2 other spells. Or reanimating an Avacyn Angel of Hope, or maybe an Emrakul the Promised End. This is also why the deck runs Body Double. This shapeshifter is basically a clone, but for creatures in the graveyard instead of on the battlefield. This can very easily be a huge threat early on if we manage to mill an opponent's huge threat early on. This can also be accomplished with Beacon of Unrest, which then shuffles itself back into our library after we cast it. We can also use it to reanimate a creature from our graveyard as well, not just our opponents. Mnemonic Betrayal exiles all of our opponents' graveyards, and we're then able to cast any cards from them until end of turn. Although it's not free, we can use our mana as though it were of any color to cast them. We can also punish our opponents for having a huge graveyard. Guild Feeder is a great way to one-shot an opponent once you've milled enough of their deck. It has Fear, which is a good form of evasion. So if it's attacking and isn't blocked, the opponent it's attacking loses 1 life for each card in their graveyard. This is a great card that can take an opponent out of nowhere. On the topic of hurting opponents due to the amount of cards in their graveyard, we can also hurt opponents as we're milling them in order to maximize the pain. Before milling an opponent, you might want to activate Duskmantle Guildmage's first ability. Doing so makes that player lose 1 life for each card that's being milled. Its second ability is too overcosted for what it does, but it is a 2/2 with a great first ability, at least for a deck like this one. Sir Conrad the Grim also hurts opponents as we mill them, although he only pings whenever a creature card is milled instead of a card per se. It's still a great ability because it also counts creatures that are discarded or destroyed. He can also mill the entire table for 1 generic and 1 black, but that's not necessarily crucial in this deck since we don't want to be milling ourselves. Another great card for this strategy is Mind Crank. It's a great way to punish opponents when milling them out. You might kill them faster this way than by simply milling them, so it's good to take that into consideration. The mill archetype isn't without its weaknesses. Although we can work around the weakness of having to mill a 100-card deck, some decks are resilient against milling because they might include cards that are shuffled back into the library when entering the graveyard. Fortunately, there are ways around that. Although these effects might non-bow with some other strategies in the deck, they're important to include since we need ways to deal with those types of cards. Denying Wind and Nightmare Incursion allow us to search through an opponent's library in order to exile cards from it. This can be used not just to exile their Eldrazi Titans or Incarnations or other cards that shuffle back into their library, but you can also be evil and exile their win cons as well. If you have an opponent that's playing a Graveyard Matters deck or some other archetype that takes advantage of having a huge graveyard, I'm running Ashok Dream Render just to be on the safe side. What's great about this Ashok is that you don't really have to activate its activated ability because its static ability is really good, especially if you get it out early. It stops fetch lands dead in its tracks as well as any other type of ramp or tutor. But if you notice that an opponent's deck is graveyard dependent, just push the red button and activate Ashok. We don't have to hit all opponents either. Maybe just one of them has a graveyard strategy. Then just hit that opponent with Bojuka Bog and be done with it. We can also punish opponents with exile via creatures like Sire of Stagnation. Whenever an opponent has a land enter the battlefield, not only do they exile the top 2 cards of their library, but we draw 2 cards off of it. As a bonus, it has 7 toughness, which makes it useful as a way to mill 7 cards off of Phenax's ability. Also, if during a game we end up having to exile too many cards from opponents' libraries and or graveyards, we can still take advantage of that with Oblivion Sower. This Eldrazi can function as a crazy ramp spell in that, given enough lands exiled, you can just take control of them when you cast it. There have been plenty of games where casting this has gotten me 12 lands for the price of 6 generic mana. Not only that, but those lands enter the battlefield under my control untapped. Talk about value. But perhaps the best plan B of all when it comes to exiling cards from the top of a library is Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Similar to Fleet Swallower, Ulamog triggers just by attacking and not by successfully dealing combat damage to the face. That means that for just turning it sideways, you get to exile the top 20 cards of that opponent's library. If that weren't enough, you get to exile 2 permanents when you exile it. It's also a 10-10 for 10 generic, so there's also that. Since we're discussing exiling, the best way to get rid of threats is by exiling it. So, along with all the other cards in this deck from the Theros block, Curse of the Swine is included as a way to get rid of any creature without Shroud. It bypasses Indestructible and can also exile any number of creatures as long as we have the mana to pull it off, which isn't a problem for this deck. Or, even better than all that, just bounce every non-land permanent you don't own to their owner's hands with Cyclonic Rift. That bypasses everything from Shroud to Indestructible, etc. The deck also runs other ways of disrupting opponents or enhancing our own strategies besides all the aforementioned ones. Clever Impersonator can be used to copy any non-land permanent on the battlefield. This is just an amazing card and it's basically a 1-card Swiss Army knife. We can also copy any land on the battlefield with Thespian Stage. Fog Bank and Guard Gomazoa are great walls to include since they're cheap to cast and can be used to block any creature without trample, regardless of how big it is, and survive to then tap to mill later on. Thassa, God of the Sea, is a 5/5 for 3 mana that isn't a creature unless we have a Devotion to Blue of 5 or greater. But when it is a creature, it's a 5/5 with Indestructible that can also be used as a blocker as well as a creature that can be tapped down to mill 5. Not only that, but she allows us to scry 1 at the beginning of our upkeep. She can also make any creature we control unblockable for just 2 mana. Although not super relevant in the deck, it's a good way to consistently attack with Fleet Swallower and Guild Feeder without worrying about them dying in combat, since they'd be unblockable. Crashing Drawbridge is another Throne of Eldraine card I found space for in the deck, since it has 4 toughness for just 2 generic mana. That might not seem as efficient as the other walls, but you can tap it down to give haste to our creatures. That allows us to tap down our other walls the same turn they enter the battlefield. And not just them, but we can also attack with Fleet Swallower, Guild Feeder, Ulamog, etc. That way, attacking with them isn't telegraphed, since we'd be able to do so the same turn they enter the battlefield. Other haste enablers include Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves, which provide the added bonus of Hexproof and Shroud respectively. Shroud can also be provided by Whispersilk Cloak as well as unblockable. If we need to find any cards in the deck, we can dig through the deck with massive draw spells like Stroke of Genius or Blue Sun's Zenith, which can also be used to finish off any opponent with a thin enough library. We can always just downright tutor for any answers with Limdul's Vault, Vampiric Tutor, and Demonic Tutor. I know that technically Limdul's Vault isn't a tutor, but it's a very effective way to dig through our library until we find what we're looking for. And, most of the time, we're looking for Eat of the Dead. We can also draw a card at the end of each of our turns if we're the Monarch thanks to Throne of the High City. With the amount of defenses we have, we will more than likely keep the Monarchy for a long time. Being on a mana-producing land means that we can include it in the deck trouble-free. It's also a fun multiplayer mechanic, so there's that as well. Now that I mentioned lands, the rest of the deck are just mana rocks and lands. Since mana acceleration in blue-black is pretty much limited to mana rocks, the deck is running Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, and Talisman of Dominance, which can tap to give us any colors, as well as Chrome Mox and Mox Amber, which have the potential of doing the same. The deck also runs Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Soul Ring, and Thought Vessel, which eliminates our maximum hand size. As far as lands that provide a ton of mana, the deck runs Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, as well as the Cabal Coffers plus Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth combo. It also runs Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God to get more mana out of our lands, since they can be tapped to activate Nykthos or Cabal Coffers. The deck's also running all 8 fetch lands, as well as Darkwater Catacombs, Drowned Catacomb, Morphic Pool, Sunken Hollow, Sunken Ruins, Tainted Isle, Underground River, Underground Sea, and Watery Grave for the double colors. The rest of the lands are 8 basic islands and 4 basic swamps. Although Phenax, God of Deception, is essentially going to command a mill deck, this brew is just an idea of how to build around him. You don't need to build it exactly as I have, and there is plenty of space to make the deck more cutthroat than this. This build is more on the casual side of things. You can easily build this deck with way more tutors to consistently find Eater of the Dead, as well as a ton of counter magic to secure your combo, as well as preventing other players from comboing off. So you could basically remove all the walls used for milling and all the support for that in favor of tutors and counter spells. That would make the deck way more formidable, but I use this deck as is for more casual pods. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.